different. It has, the spiritual world is real, and it has substance, as it were, but it is different from the physical world that we're connected to. We'll talk a little bit more about that. It's a difficult concept, but it means that our body is going to be different. The fifth thing I want to say is that it is going to be similar, yet it's going to be distinct from the present body. So when, well, let's read what the scripture says. Let me make some comments on it. So similar yet distinct. 1 Corinthians 15. And by the way, if you want to look and you want to understand, you want to read about the resurrection, go to 1 Corinthians 15 and read the whole chapter. Because that's a lot of what we're coming out of. You want to understand what has been told us about the resurrection, there are really two places you can look. 1 Corinthians 15 and then anything at the end of any of the Gospels concerning the body of Jesus himself. Because we know our body will be after his body. We'll be in that pattern, in that image of his body. But let's look at what it says here on our bulletin sheet there. But someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come? You know, I mean that's a legitimate question. We're curious. We want to know. And he says, well, how foolish. When you sow, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. When you sow, and understand now, as Paul's writing this idea of the resurrection, he has, Paul's from a world where everybody was pretty much farmers, okay? So he's begun to use farming phrases. Those of you who plant gardens and are planting flowers now, you can understand these phrases as well. Because Paul's going to talk about the body in terms of agriculture, okay? About planting something, and when you plant seeds, or you plant bulbs if you're planting flowers, or you're planting grain in the ground, what you're putting in the ground is not what you're expecting to come up, right?
Yes.
It's going to be somewhat similar, yet distinct. You put one seed of corn in, but you don't want one seed to come out, right? You want a whole ear, or numbers of ears of corn, or you put one sweet potato in and you want a whole bunch of sweet potatoes to grow out of it. You want it to be similar yet distinct. So listen to what he says here. Verse 37. When you sow, you do not plant the body that will be, but just a seed, perhaps of wheat or of something else. Okay, he's drifting into the farm idea. But God gives it a body as he determines, and to each kind of seed he gives its own body. Not all flesh is the same. People have one kind of flesh, animals have another, birds have another, and fish another. You'd agree, right? I mean, a pig is not like a fish, it's different. A cow is not like a bird. Those kind of bodies have similarities, but they're all different. There are also heavenly bodies and there are earthly bodies. But the splendor of the heavenly bodies is one kind, and the splendor of the earthly bodies is another. Now, when he's talking about heavenly bodies here, he's not talking about our bodies. He's now drifted from the ground to the sky, and Paul's outside and he's looking at the sun and the moon and all of the stars, and he's saying, these things, you know, the moon is different than the sun is different than the stars, and they're amazing, but they're all different. And so he says the sun has one kind of splendor, the moon another, and the stars another, and the stars differ from star to star. So what is he trying to say in this passage? He is saying that when this body comes to life, it is going to be similar to what died. The question, it's a legitimate question, is in the resurrection, are we going to know, how are we going to know people in the resurrection? Okay, so here's the good news. I'm going to give you like good news and bad news. Okay, so the good news is you're going to be able to recognize people in the resurrection the way you recognize them now. The bad news is if you hate the way you look now, you're going to be stuck with it for a long time. So, you know what? If it's fine if you want to change your shape of your nose or your ears or your eyebrows or whatever you want to change the shape of who you are. Ultimately, we know that when the disciples saw Jesus, they recognized him, right? So he was not unrecognizable to them. So if your imagination is that, gee, I can't wait for the resurrection because I'm going to look like a model, sorry, okay? But the good thing is that all those models aren't going to look like themselves either, right? Now, they may look in the mirror and say, I don't know who that person is, but there is going to be this transformation that's going to go in the body, but it's going to be recognizable. So you know what? Save your money, donate it to the church instead of doing all the cosmetic surgery. That's my opinion. But because you're going to have to get used to this body. And you know what? You look the way you do because God created you that way. And no matter how you want to look like somebody else, if God wanted you to look like somebody else, that's the stamp he would have used on you. But that's not what he used. So there is this similar yet distinct body that God is going to give us. The next thing here is that it is raised in glory. 1 Corinthians 15:43. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. No matter what we try to do in this life to bring dignity at death, no matter what we do, and we can and should do things that are respectful of those who are dead. No matter what we do, there is a basic dishonor in the whole idea of death, right? Because that which was living suddenly isn't living anymore. That a person who was responding maybe just a few hours before that or a few moments before that isn't able to respond to us anymore. So there is a dishonor that comes with death. And we all know that. And that dishonor translates itself in some way into our lives in grief and in separation. But what the Bible tells us is that what happens at the resurrection transforms that dishonor into glory. And we know that glory is something that's reserved for God. Glory is the reflection of God. It tells us in the Scripture God doesn't share His glory with anybody, at least on this side of the grave. But we know that sometimes people are reflective of God's glory. Moses, remember when Moses was up on the mountain? He had been with God and they saw this glory in his face. We know that there is going to be a reflection of God in the life to come. So this body is going to be raised no longer in that dishonor, but raised in glory. And then also, the second part of that is, it's raised in power. 1 Corinthians 15:43 again. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. And of course, isn't that one of the things about death that is so difficult and so heart-wrenching to deal with? Because death is all about human powerlessness. Is that we don't have, no matter the best doctor,